All right, we have the pleasure to talk again to my good friend Levan Vasadze. It's a perfect time to go over what's happening in Georgia because it's a mess right now. We've seen in the news that there's an attempt at a color revolution. I was just in DC last night talking to some folks that are pretty supportive of Trump, but even they didn't understand what was going on. And as everyone knows who's watched the show or paid attention to my involvement in Georgia, Levan is the leading light for conservatives, for traditionalists in Georgia and the entire region. My hope is one day he's prime minister. But there's a long backstory to all of that, including him being poisoned and almost dying. But let's concentrate on right now. What's going on in Georgia?
Brian, hi, and greetings to our beloved American friends and conservatives. Georgia is on the brink of a possible another yet color revolution orchestrated by the liberals and the globalists. That's it in a nutshell. And there's no question about that. So ask me questions and let me sort of help you navigate through this and deconstruct this for our American and English-speaking conservative friends around the world who have high regard for what you do, Brian.
Thank you. So let's go back. You had an election, the legitimate election. The ruling party, Georgian Dream, won. Now, almost immediately, there was well, not a withdrawal, but a stop on talks to join the EU. Can you go from the election through the stop in talks to join the EU to what happened next as far as people taking to the streets and violence?
Sure. Georgian Dream, which was founded by an influential businessman, some call him oligarch. His name is Bidzina Ivanishvili, has been in power for the last 12 years. It came into power in 2012 through democratic elections where he and they defeated the tyrannic rule of the predecessor, President Mikhail Saakashvili, who was the product of a color revolution in 2003. During the reign of Saakashvili, which was the pet project for liberals and globalists, Georgia jailed roughly 10% of its male population of working age.
You went to jail too, didn't you, during that time?
I was lucky to avoid jail,
Okay.
but I was repressed and my businesses were attacked. And this whole reign of Saakashvili's government was a huge, gigantic, classical experiment of radical liberal reforms in the country, which ended through massive protests in the population and, thank God, a bloodless democratic victory of the now ruling party, Georgian Dream. Now, what is interesting to know is that in 2012, immediately after the elections, Ivanishvili's Georgian Dream went ahead and betrayed the electorate by doing several things. First of all, Hillary Clinton came to visit Tbilisi and taught us a new English word, cohabitation, where basically she explained to us that all the atrocities and violations of the human rights perpetrated by the Saakashvili government should have been left untouched by the Georgian legal system, and the perpetrators of these atrocities should have been accepted as a defeated political minority who would be in the parliament, not jailed, not persecuted for what they did. So Ivanishvili went ahead and did just that, disappointing hugely the electorate. Then he went ahead and proceeded with, to our unpleasant surprise, with liberal reforms under the dictatorship of the globalist agenda. For example, 2013, they adopted the so-called anti-discrimination law, which is basically a law aimed at promoting and supporting all sorts of sexual deviations and disorientations in any society, something completely alien to our society and our Christian values. They decriminalized narcotics and drugs. They opened borders to the immigration from the Middle East. They multiplied casinos and gambling all over the country. And this has been, throughout the 12 years, the basis or the reason for our critique and opposition to our new disappointment.
Right. Now, and I mean, we did the World Congress of Families together in 2016. And at the time, you know, you and I had spoken, and that's where we first, I think, started to become real friends. And I was learning about Georgian politics. And at the time, Georgian Dream were the people that were pushing all of this on us. They were supporting the liberal agenda when it comes to not maybe as far as same-sex marriage, but other things, moving the Overton window, trying to change the way Georgians perceive themselves and their family and the country.
Absolutely. So we can say without a mistake that one liberal regime has been changed with another one, perhaps less brutal and repressive in terms of jailings of the people, but in terms of the ideology, basically a continuation of the globalist liberal line. So you would ask me why, on God's green earth, all of a sudden, the globalists who have enjoyed total obedience of oligarch Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream have decided to overthrow him in the now ongoing attempt to dispute what has been largely a democratic election and cause another yet color revolution by backing violent street protests who harm, injure, and damage hundreds of Georgian law enforcement officers and policemen. And the reason is quite simple, really. Ever since the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war, Georgian Dream, as the pet of globalists, has been urged, asked, suggested to open the so-called Second Front from the south against the Russians. Now, please remember that back in 2008, the predecessor of Ivanishvili, the mentioned Mikhail Saakashvili, did just that when he went ahead and instigated or provoked an escalation of a military conflict with Russia in our two separatist regions, actually, namely one of the two, in so-called South Ossetia, and caused us great losses, both in terms of manpower, army, and the recognition by Russia of these two secessionist regions of Georgia as so-called independent countries by Russia.
1 second on this, because people I don't know many Americans understand that 1/3 of your territory is currently is essentially under Russian control. It's separatist, and that at the time Saakashvili took a big a terrible decision, assuming that the United States and George Bush would come in and sort of back him in the fight, and that did not happen, and therefore you lost your territory. So I think the key point here is that you've already been down this road,
Absolutely.
and uh, the reality is that people, I don't think people understand. You're right on the Georgian military road connects you directly to Russia. Any conflict with Russia, again, even with your great, warriors, your great people, it's a much smaller country, and realistically, you would just be rolled.
Exactly. And so this is what happened after the Russo-Ukrainian war. The Western powers, especially the US embassy in Tbilisi, has been doing everything it could to force this up until then pet Georgian dream and oligarch Ivanishvili to just ignite another yet war in the south region of Russia. Now, that would be a suicide for us, because no matter how brave our warriors are and our spirit is, we're just a very small country. And if Europe's largest country, Ukraine, can do very little against the might of world's largest country territorially, Russia, imagine what would happen to us. So naturally, Ivanishvili and his government refused. And this is where it gets interesting. Now, after they refused, they basically abandoned their power base. Remember, I told you, when they came into 2012 on the back of the gigantic national protests, they betrayed the source of their power, the people, switched completely into the obedience of the globalist liberals, and continued as if nothing happened. Now they were forced to abandon that source of power and seek back another one. So they had to revert back to people and convert to conservatism, because Georgia is one of the most religious countries in the world. It's an ancient Christian tradition and very strong identity, its own language unrelated to anybody else, one of 14 original alphabets in the world, and hence, by definition, a very conservative traditionalist country. So Ivanishvili did a 180 this spring, because he had a choice of either obeying the orders of the globalists, going to war with Russia, and basically committing a suicide, both politically and perhaps physically, or reverting back to the alternative, the real source of power, the Georgian people, and saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to adopt the conservative agenda. And as the politicians often do, without blinking, basically, they adopted our entire traditionalist agenda. For example, they started squeezing George Soros-funded NGOs, which we have plenty of in Georgia, by adopting a law on the transparency of NGOs. Then they went ahead and, thank God, banned the propaganda of LGBT among the minors, etc. So
many of the things that you were leading when we went back and had all those people in front of Parliament to stop the push for this gay pride parade. At the time, we knew that there were people in the police, in law enforcement, that supported what you were doing, and me to a much smaller, on a much smaller scale, joining you there as an American. But, I never thought that the government was going to take on your line, and essentially they've changed.
Exactly. And as you rightfully mentioned, I was poisoned because I was sort of permitted to do these things along with many other Georgian conservatives as an outsider right before I entered politics. But the moment I announced that I'm creating the social movement aimed at transferring it into a political party. I fell ill with blood cancer, which can be caused with radiation poisoning, and almost died, as you know, and spent half a year and underwent 24 basically lethal dose courses of chemo. So for me, physically, it has been extremely difficult to observe the cynicism of the 180 turn of Ivanishvili this spring. That said, without being bitter or without being narcissist, without actually believing a second the honesty of this turn, as a statesman, as a sovereignist, as a patriot, I, just like many other conservatives, felt obliged to back them in that turn. Because at the end of the day, if you love your country, if you're devoted to its future, it doesn't matter what happens to you. What matters is the policies. And if you burn as a branch of wood in that fire, but still are able to witness the conversion of the policies towards conservative Christian values, you can only be happy irrespective of what happens to you personally. So that has been our sort of emotionless, rational, patriotic stance on what they did this spring. And then basically the rest is history, because after disobeying the globalist liberal agenda, Georgian Dream and Bidzina Ivanishvili became targets of criticism. And we're witnessing the peak, the culmination of that criticism now, because last October we held parliamentary elections. Georgia, as you know, has been converted from being a presidential republic, unfortunately, to a parliamentary republic, whereby prime minister is much more powerful and important than the president. I say unfortunately because I firmly believe we ought to go back to the presidential system. We do have a president who is very unimportant and weak, but long story short, they held the elections, everybody recognized them as completely transparent and fair, and Georgian Dream won these elections, irrespective of what we think of their two-faced policies over the past 12 years. I firmly believe that the result, the win, would not have been possible had not Georgian Dream converted last spring to conservative values for the reasons mentioned earlier. And after they won these elections, they entered the spiral of endless criticism and escalating street violence by the groups backed by liberal media in Georgia and the organizations like George Soros-funded NGOs aimed at overthrowing government at any cost. And this is what we are witnessing right now. Unfortunately, we're in the middle of that process now. Now, in the classical book of globalism...
Can we step back 1 second? Sorry to interrupt. Just to be clear, the Prime Minister Irakli, Kobakidze, is Georgian Dream. And so many people are confusing things in the United States because, as you just said, your president does not have a large amount of power, but your president, Salome Zorobichvili, is that how you say it?
Salome
Zorobichvili. She is out there at the EU. She's out there publicly saying that the elections were illegal or marred by irregularities. We need new elections. And so she is 100% against Georgian Dream and the prime minister. And this is getting all sorts of press. So can you explain why Salome, your president, is so at odds right now with your prime minister?
Same reason I hate politics, Brian, and I only went into it out of love to my country and suffered the consequences that I suffered. Salome is a descendant of Georgian immigrants who fled to Paris after Bolshevik occupation in 1920s. She's a descendant of people who abandoned Georgia and ran to Paris, kidnapping along with them the treasury of the nation. She was born and raised in France. She's culturally French. She's a total liberal, and she served in French foreign ministry, and she is an employee of French secret services. Now, ironically, because of her French background, it was Saakashvili, the predecessor of Ivanishvili, Mikhail Saakashvili, who first brought her in as the foreign minister because of her foreign connections. Mm-hmm. And the ironic and bitter thing is, when Ivanishvili came to power and when they had another round of presidential elections, it was Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream who promoted her, despite the protests of all the Georgian conservatives who knew very well who she was, as the president. And now she's backstabbing him. This is why I said, this is why I hate politics, which has, in any country, in any culture, very little space for decent, honest people like yourself. And so,
well, she's also a lib. I mean, she's really a liberal. She's really in the middle of, you know, coming from France, coming back into Georgia. Her values don't seem to represent the values of Georgians.
Oh, yeah, don't even get me started. I mean, I don't want to get into her dirty laundry, but this is a woman who violates everything in terms of the moral Christian values, both in her sexual conduct and her way of life. And her rating, therefore, among the Georgians is zilch. And now she is playing this consolidator role of all of the demons who are up for the color revolution. Now, what would this color revolution bring us if, God forbid, it happens? And let's talk a little bit, what are the odds of that taking place?
Okay, just one thing before you go into this. These protests are still going on, but your prime minister and it seems like law enforcement are holding the line. They're not allowing them to just take over everything. And for that reason, you get all of these complaints at the EU that this is ruthless. But from what I've seen, the protesters themselves, from lighting fireworks directly at the police, throwing Molotov cocktail type things at the police, it has gotten really violent, and the government has attempted to pretty carefully stop this, but they keep going on. Like even tonight, they're going on, right? I mean, is it every day?
Just turn it on and enjoy the hypocrisy of globalist liberals. I mean, my God, you had American conservatives walking the corridors of the Capitol, and a woman gets shot in the neck, and that's okay. But when you see these Georgian protesters aiming customized pyrotechnic handmade grenades, Molotov cocktails in the face of our policemen. We have something like 150 Georgian policemen with their skulls and jaws fractured and high-degree burns in the hospital. And when these policemen, in response, beat up one or two of these savages, this is tyranny.
This hypocrisy is what people need to understand more than anything, because
entire global media tells them that it's a tyrant who needs to be deposed.
It's ridiculous. They talk about democracy, and then as soon as an election happens and they don't like the results, oh, it's time for a redo. We're going to do it over again. I mean,
Exactly. Why?
and I'm even getting this from folks on my Twitter feed. I'm simply pointing out the absolute hypocrisy. Anyone can see it, and like a knee-jerk reaction, like Pavlov's dogs, immediately Russia, Russia,
Oh
Russia,
yeah.
and people don't even care that it doesn't make sense that if you look, there was no election observers saying there was massive fraud. There's no proof of any fraud.
No, no.
It's simply that they didn't want Georgian Dream to win, so they're going to throw out the entire government and bring Georgia to potentially a cataclysmic fight with Russia
Oh
for
yeah, and ignite and burn down Georgia just like they did with poor Ukraine.
yeah.
And Russia, how can you say every seventh Georgian is a refugee from Abkhazia and so-called South Ossetia due to ethnic cleansing, which took place in 1992, 1993, 1994.
This
And
is what
how
people
can
don't understand. You've already been through all this, and you're smart. You know that you've got to be careful. There's no need to unnecessarily provoke or get into a fight
Oh
with
yeah,
Russia. And
and we
being
don't
prudent,
want to exactly, and we don't want to commit suicide. And it so happened neither does our two-faced oligarch. So our interests all of a sudden got
yeah,
aligned.
yeah. And so where does it go from here, Levan? Where do we go from here?
Look,
What's next?
if we take the classical instruction books of the demons like the Ackermans and others on how to do color revolutions, you basically have three main methods, not exclusive of each other. Sometimes a combination of these three can be used and are used to overthrow democratically elected governments. Number one is street riots and street protests, which we're seeing right now. Number two is a coup d'etat, so let's say a military revolt by the army. And number three is an assassination of the leader. Okay? So let's talk about all three of them individually. We're seeing what's happening on the first method, and obviously the highest culmination of that method is the so-called sacred victim, where basically those who orchestrate these revolutions kill themselves, one of the protesters, just like they did in Ukraine, the so-called Heavenly Hundred, when 100 people were shot on Maidan by the snipers from the opposing hotels. And nobody up until now has proved that it was the government's fault who did that. So all of these escalating levels of beatings of people are aimed at that, and God forbid we arrive at that. And for the security services, it is very difficult to prevent that, because in that chaos of thousands of people, how can you control who pulls a gun on whom and who kills whom? So, and because people watch this on TV as idiots and say, "Oh, the government is violent," and then the wave rises. Then this small group of protesters gets the real support in the clueless population. So, method number one, God forbid they bring it to the death, entirely possible within the next few weeks. The second method, I hope I'm not wrong, I think is less likely. I mean, the military coup. Why? Because they're hostages, liberals are hostages to their own policies here. They went ahead and did everything they could to discredit Georgian army, not have Georgian army have faces who are popular and respected in the society. So basically, we have an army, we have great warriors, we have heroes of our anti-separatist wars, but we don't have powerful, popular in the society leaders who could serve as the spearheads to a military turnover. So I'm hoping that's not possible. And number three, assassination on the life of the leader, I mean Bidzina Ivanishvili. No matter how sort of disappointed I am in the man as a Christian, of course, I pray that this doesn't happen to any person, let alone the leader of my country. So I know he's heavily guarded and very well protected, and I'm hoping that can never take place. So we go back to method number one, and that's where the highest risks right now lie. Now let's fast forward this tape or the CD, if we can, and say, what happens the day after, God forbid, if they depose the government? Yeah, they will install their obedient pets and go to war with Russia. You ask me, what's in it for them? Because Georgia will not last very long. No matter how patriotic and brave we are, we'll just burn down. Russian army will flatten us. So why are they doing this? Read Zbigniew Brzezinski, the great chessboard. Look at the neocon mentality. They don't care. They just want chaos. They just want to ignite as many fires as they can around Eurasia, the so-called circle of Anaconda, to just to cause chaos. And they don't care. They even said in the private conversations with Georgian leaders, yes, you will last 3 or 4 days, but you have a wonderful mountainous terrain. We will back you in your partisan wars. We already have Northern Caucasian exiles in Turkey saying we are ready to help Georgian people in their fight for democracy. We are ready to go in. So this is the scenario that awaits us if, God forbid, it happens. Another chaos in South Caucasus. And how do you explain this to a 20-year-old on the streets of Tbilisi who has a handmade Molotov cocktail? You can't, because when I asked Georgian Dream not to introduce liberal perversion, sexual education in our schools, when I spoke to them at the parliament, when I begged them not to destroy our wonderful scientific traditional school system and replace it with George Soros-funded idiocy, the kind you have in the United States, I was laughed at. So they are now boomeranging or earning. Today's 25-year-old grew up in that school system, grew up in this mirage. Listen, Brian, listen to their demands. You asked me, what is this about Georgian Prime Minister announcing that Georgia is halting talks for the accession into European Union up until 2028. For God's sake, European Union itself announced that it is halting expansion up until 2030. And it was only after that that the Georgian Prime Minister comes out and says, because this so-called accession, which will never happen, by the way, look at the map, for God's sake. For Georgia to join European Union needs to jump over Poland, jump over Ukraine, jump over Russia, and somehow accept Georgia into European Union. So it's a geographic idiocy. And so Georgian Prime Minister comes out and says, we are halting. We're going to restart negotiations to join European Union 2 years before, in 2028, 2 years before European Union itself plans to reopen these negotiations. And that alone is the basis for a totally postmodernistic nutcase hysteria. And you talk to these people, you say, please explain to me what you are protesting. Just animal-like screaming, swearing, cursing, and using the language you and I could never repeat.
So now we don't really know which way things are going to go, other than the fact that it does seem that um, the government has been strong in being able to withstand the initial few weeks. It's also gotten, I think, stronger in um, not allowing the protesters to just do whatever they want. There have been arrests, but you still think that uh, that the color revolution playbook number one, the street protest, has a chance of toppling Georgian Dream.
Yes, because you have this layer of strata of feminized in a bad sense of the word. Nothing wrong with our women and feminism, feminine roots, but feminized in the liberal sense of the word, irrational, idiotic, urban, liberal population, which is manipulated like sheep with by liberal media. Rewind back a couple of years, and I think you and your viewers will have to agree with me when I say that most of the atheist liberals in the United States, in Georgia, in Europe, were much easier to manipulate under COVID propaganda than the conservatives, the church-going people, the believers. Because why? Because their mindset is completely prepared for mass manipulation. Same thing here. You have this layer, unfortunately, of the new breed created, including by the Georgian Dream in the last 12 years, brainwashed people who will repeat everything the liberal media tells them. So unfortunately, we are very worried, and we are witnessing this spiral going up. You have thousands of people coming out on the street as zombies, our friends, our relatives, and saying Georgia is being robbed of European future. And when you try to deconstruct this as a conservative or as a Christian and say, okay, let's begin with the demographic argument. Every European nation has a birth rate below replacement value, for God's sake, because of the divorce rates, the abortion rates. You know this better than most Americans do. Most Western European nations have a birth rate 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, instead of the necessary 2.1. So European future is an oxymoron, purely from the demographic standpoint. I want European past for Georgia, which was the past of Christian values, hardworking people believing in God, yes? And another argument is that this is this myth of progressism, when people have been zombied into believing that we are ascending into some sort of an earthly heaven called Western Europe. The Brussels bureaucrats are gentle, kind, and friendly to us, and they're waiting for Georgian people to just swim to their shores. And we just need to permit the so-called gay pride parades, liberalization of narco, everything. Just do it in advance, and then you will be accepted. And once you are accepted, the model in the brains of these people is once that happens, it's like a quantum leap. Then we won't have to work. You know, everything, we turn into heaven. Everyone, they will just feed us, you know, black caviar and best friend cheeses. And this is their mindset. And the moment you try to dispute this liberal nonsense, you know what they say to you? Oh, you're a Russian spy.
Yeah. No,
Because you don't want to believe in my religion. Yeah. You want to be occupied again.
It is interesting how almost magical their worldview is. It's true that veneration withers upon the pavement, but veneration for the true God withers upon the pavement to a certain degree. Cities, especially the time and day we live in, are the easiest places for people to come with dreams of making it, and then they lose their respect for their ancestors, their religion. But the interesting thing to me is that they do lose that, but then they embrace some uh, fake religion. It's like
Mirage.
magic, and so like on the EU front, it's a new religion. It's a magic religion that if we join the EU, all of our problems will fade
We,
away, and
be-
it'll be
we,
like heaven on earth.
we become immortals. And, you know, I've been saying something sort of childishly direct and simple. I've been saying we are the center of Caucasus. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, the father of modern anthropology, called the white race Caucasians because of our beauty.
Yeah,
Read this.
yeah,
He said he referred to Georgian men as the and I say we are the center of Caucasus. We do not need to be a periphery of anything.
yeah,
You know, we have this ancient, beautiful culture. Let's turn this into quote unquote southern Switzerland,
yeah.
the
Neutral.
neutral zone where everybody needs this. The Western Empire needs this. The Russian Empire needs this. The former Ottoman Empire needs this. The Persian Empire needs this. A place of cooperation, not a battleground but for us to do that, we need to have the center, the core, the axis, which can only be in our tradition. We respect, you come to Old Town, to Tbilisi, and on one street we have the mosque, the synagogue, Armenian church, Russian church, Georgian churches, you know. Queen Tamara had the parliament 50 years before Magna Carta, for God's sake.
Right.
We don't have gender in our verbs.
Yeah.
And some Soros-funded primitive idiots should teach me how to treat my wife and children.
Yeah. It is so disrespectful, Levan, what they're doing. It's so disrespectful of a great and ancient culture. It's so disrespectful of it's evil. And you know that you and I believe that. What worries me is, we know we had our great victory with Trump. You know how happy I was that yeah.
Congratulations. And
But
you and I lived through his first term
yeah.
also in Georgia when President Trump didn't even get around changing one liberal ambassador around the globe. So unfortunately, through his first term,
Yeah.
he'd not only not be able to drain the swamp in DC,
Yeah.
but he couldn't even touch one little embassy in
I do
Tbilisi.
have to I do have to tell you, Levan, that's one thing I was talking about last night in DC with different folks, is what the administration is planning on ambassadorships. And look, anything can happen, but I will say right now that there's going to be a different ball game when it comes to the ambassadorships and the priority of having new ambassadors around the world.
Excuse my interrupting, Brian,
Yeah.
keeping my fingers crossed, but let me reciprocate your kindness to me and say that after the speech that you gave in the center of Tbilisi, when we were preventing and prevented the parade of sexual perversion in Tbilisi, you have become the most beloved American in Georgia. So if United States wants to, in my opinion, tell your friends in Washington, if United States wants to restore its image in Tbilisi, there's only one man who should be the ambassador to Tbilisi. And he's sitting across the ocean.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at him right
You
now.
know, I would love to do it, and we'll see. We'll see what happens with the administration. I do think that people need to understand and get out of this notion that people don't realize how important Georgia is geopolitically, as you said, as a potential Switzerland in the middle of the Caucasus, as a great and ancient Christian culture, but also as a crossroads of different civilizations. It's critical, and especially critical given what's going on with this attempt at a color revolution. The last thing we need is another explosion geopolitically. And again, Americans who want Georgia to be great, the U.S. to be great, each country in its own way to be great, and not to come in and tell you, what to do, but to actually cooperate. That's what we need, and I am hopeful. We will see, but I am hopeful because I do see the administration giving a lot more. You have to remember, the first time around, there wasn't time for planning. It was a surprise that he won, and there was not a ton of planning as to who was going to take over the positions. He had 4,000 positions to fill. Now, a lot of those positions are already done, and the ambassadorships are not going to be seen as an afterthought. I know that. Now, as far as who is picked, um, we've got to encourage someone who is actually conservative to be picked, number one, because some of Trump's picks for ambassadorships, um, first of all, he left a lot of the ambassadors that Obama had chosen in place. That was disaster number one. But two, there were some bad picks that were not actually conservative. I don't think he's going to do that again. I'm hopeful that he won't do that. But that pick is very important. So again, I'm doing whatever I can here. I will say that uh, as this plays out, uh, that the most important thing, Georgia Dream, if I could give a little bit of advice from the United States, they need to get the narrative, the truth out. Because right now, even conservatives are being
Exactly.
suckered
You and
in.
I are now, right now doing the job of Georgian foreign ministry.
Yeah.
And
They,
I thank you for this.
yeah.
I being completely ousted by the Georgian dream. And excuse my interrupting,
Yeah.
but I need to stress this for your American viewers. I was one of the two very first Georgians to go for studies and education in the United States while Soviet Union was still around. Make no mistake, we the traditionalist Christian conservative Georgians love real America. I mean, I love anything from William Faulkner's literature
Yeah.
to Richard Weaver's philosophy, ideas have consequences, for which I am grateful that you've introduced me to. I love Elvis,
Mhm.
and yes, I'm
And you have an Indian
I'm
motorcycle.
yes, I'm a professional former rugby player, and I do believe rugby should not be played with pads and helmets
We
on.
disagree
But
on that, but
but
yeah.
I respect American football as well.
Yeah.
But long story short, for God's sake, I mean, look at me, look at my American English, for God's sake. But it's been a total disappointment in terms of the domination of perverted liberals in American foreign policy.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to explain this. And thank God I have friends like this who give me the opportunity to voice this message. But by God, the picture that the United States has about Georgia, just look at what's going on right now. We have a most cynical, hypocritical, demonic, anti-human, anti-democratic revolution attempt going on in Georgia, and people in Washington are sitting and saying, oh, people of Georgia are trying to overthrow the tyrant. Now, no, NGOs are trying to overthrow an oligarch who converted, just like I explained in our talk show, to conservative. And thank God, we as Christians cannot deny a person an opportunity to convert to something better, right? Who am I to say, oh, because you misbehaved in the past? That's something completely anti-Christian, isn't it? If I say, if you behaved badly in the past, I don't believe your actions now. How can I? And so let's hope that this thing passes us. But Brian, I'm very worried.
All right. Well, we're going to have to talk more. I do think that if there's any way to get messages into Georgian Dream, that they need to get people in DC to explain this. I'll do what I can do on my show. Again, I'm going to work to get you on any other shows because I'll tell you
Always
this
ready.
right now, our conversation, this last hour and however many minutes, anyone who's listening to this, they're not going to get this anywhere else. No
Oh,
one
yeah.
is talking about it. Everyone is reading the headlines and they have no clue what's actually happening. So thank you for taking the time to open people's eyes up to the truth that's happening. And we'll keep working together. And you know, you're my brother.
I thank you for this opportunity. Always ready. God bless America. God bless Georgia.